So what does invisible pollution mean to you?
I guess most pollution is invisible, probably, right? Like greenhouse gases and yeah, maybe just the stuff that it's easy to not think about in the moment, but matters in the long term, I guess. Yeah.
And so how much do you, or how often do you think about the threat of a nuclear event?
I guess like more in the past year and a half than I have prior to that with the like war with Russia and Ukraine.
Oh, okay.
I feel like that caused me to think about it more than previously because I feel like that has been like the highest like probability of something happening in our lifetime. I think so.
And do you think to
I don't think about it that often.
Oh, okay.
But for a while there, like at the beginning of the war, I was thinking about it like maybe a couple times a week. Yeah.
Do you think about, well, is it more like war or like nuclear kind of weapons?
I guess I feel like probably the
like the starting
nuclear
point.
weapons would be used in the context of war most likely. I think. Yeah.
And so, what forms of pollution do you interact with on a daily basis?
Let's see. Well, the color of the Charles is very disturbing sometimes.
Oh, is it? Oh.
Like it's just that it's very brown. I think a lot of like sewage runoff goes into the Charles when it rains. So I do think about that whenever I have like been kayaking on the Charles and stuff. Like usually I do that 2 or 3 times a year, and I always think about like, oh, don't go right after it rains because there will be the river will be full of sewage. And what else on a daily basis? Well, there was that time when like there were like wildfires around. I don't know. Were you in Boston when there were like there were a bunch of wildfires in Canada?
Yeah.
And then the like smoke blew down here. I think this was over the summer or something. And there were a few days where it was like the sky looked really ominous, and it was like people were coughing outside, and that was pretty scary. Yeah.
Do you think nuclear energy has the potential to be used for good? And
Yes, definitely. I'm generally like pro nuclear energy, I think, because of how like so much more efficient it is than fossil fuels, and I think that it's like a potential solution to climate change that a lot of people like discount because of the fear about nuclear accidents. But ultimately, like the number of people who have died in nuclear energy accidents is like so few compared to the number of people who die because of climate change. So I think that,
and so it outweighs the possibility of a nuclear disaster, you think?
I think that most likely, like the effects of like mitigating climate change would outweigh the potential of a nuclear disaster, assuming that like responsible people are in charge of the nuclear power and everything, which hopefully they would be. So yeah.
And do you think about like nuclear waste in general?
I thought about it because I listened to a podcast about it like a couple months ago, which was about I don't know if you ever heard about this, but this would be something really cool for you to look into. If not, it's called nuclear semiotics. It was a scientific like idea for a while back in, I think probably like the 70s or sometime during the Cold War. And the idea was basically that like nuclear waste is probably going to outlive our current human civilization in terms of the amount of time that it will be dangerous, like tens of thousands of years. And so like by the time our current civilization like falls and like there's some new civilization, they probably are going to like speak a totally different language. They might have like very little in common with us. So the idea was like, how do we communicate to those future people to stay away from these nuclear waste storage areas so that they don't go like digging around in there and release the nuclear waste. And people came up with all these like crazy ideas. Like they brought together a group of like scientists and philosophers and stuff to discuss it, and they're ideas were to like create like a landscape of spikes that would like warn people away, or to like try to create some sort of like myth or legend about it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you should read the Wikipedia page for nuclear semiotics. It's super interesting.
Well, this was 1981 it began.
Okay, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah. End of the Cold War.
So
okay. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But I guess I don't think about it much other than that.
Which department in MIT works with?
Yeah, so there's a nuclear engineering department. It's called Course 22. Their building is like right across the way from this building. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. There's actually a fusion reactor on campus as well.
Oh, yeah, I
MIT has
remember.
one.
Yeah.
It's like just like a few blocks that way.
Have you been?
I've seen it from. I've seen the building from the outside. I've never gone in.
Oh, okay.
But there are like undergrads who do research in there, and lots of grad students, of course. And it's crazy that we have a reactor on campus. I forget about that sometimes.
Is that how many are like? How often do you see one?
A nuclear reactor?
Yeah, or like
I've never seen one before.
Or like in general, where is it mostly like institutions that would have it?
I don't know. Probably. Yeah, probably.
So we're focusing on the specific topic of low-level nuclear medical waste and the sort of unseen risks of radiation in our community and generally in the world. And we just have a couple questions. We're trying to poll people to get a sense of how people think about this issue of radiation as a pollutant. And so the first question is, radiation is famously an invisible form of pollution. It's not like smog or gas coming up from cars. How do you think about the idea of invisibility when it comes to pollution? Or what are some forms of pollution that are very visible to you as opposed to not visible at all?
Well, on radiation and exposure to that, I think normally it depends on how it is relative to the background exposure. So there's a lot of natural sources of radiation. And so it doesn't... I think sometimes some categories rise above that natural background radiation and some below, so it would depend on where it falls in that spectrum. I'm not particularly... I'm aware of there's lots of invisible or very non-visible forms of pollution, so it doesn't scare me more or less than others.
Okay, thank you. And for you, is this something you think about or are attentive to at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I with radiation in particular, I don't know. It's not something, I guess, that... I mean, I'm aware of the dangers of it and the difficulty in storing it as the waste. But yeah, I don't know. It's not something, I guess, that's on my mind too much.
and then so alternatively, like on the other side of that question, what are some forms of pollution that you encounter in your daily life that you can't get away from?
So in this area, it's actually fairly clean in terms of very obvious. But I mean, some traffic smoke, that's less than it used to be. I bike a lot, so sometimes you're exposed to that when certain vehicles, have been a long time since they've gone through their inspections.
Right.
There's visible, garbage and things like that around here. Less so here as compared to other places that I've spent some time.
Yeah, and how about for you?
Yeah, I mean, as far as pollutions that I deal with, I mean, obviously, yeah, like you're saying, like general, like, litter and trash type things. And then also, there's waste products from, like, just my, like, work, like, I do woodworking and stuff, and so then, like, various solvents, glue, excess glues, things like that. Like, that's kind of something I'm more aware of, just in dealing with, like, things off-gassing, things like that, and trying to... take care with those things.
Right. Do you work in the trades in some way?
Yeah, woodworker.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's obviously there are a lot of there's a lot of pollution in woodworking, but it's not as toxic maybe as some of the other.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a lot of things. I mean, just even for me, like I have to be aware of like dust, right?
Right.
It's like a huge
respiratory
type issues like that. So that's like, I guess, more of like a visible one. The invisible would be like, solvents, off-gassing, storing those types of things properly and disposing of them properly.
Yeah. And then just one last question, I promise. Is the topic, and forgive me if this is kind of conceptual, but is the topic of nuclear energy, the prospect of like a nuclear winter, is this something that's like an existential worry for you, or not something you think about very much?
Well, I'll say my background, actually, I have a PhD in engineering focusing on energy planning. So
Wow.
From Harvard. So
Okay.
I may have a slightly unique perspective on it. Yeah, so nuclear winter, no. I do see nuclear as a very possible. It has a lot of potential as part of the generation mix. Dealing with the waste is a big issue. There's a variety of technologies to address it.
Yeah, but generally it sounds like you see more of a potential for nuclear to be used in energy than maybe the kind of horrific possibility of a nuclear holocaust of some sort.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the U.S., reactors haven't been built in a long time, but in other countries, many are coming up and are being built. There's new technologies and reducing risk associated with the fuel cycle, less frequent refueling. So, in terms of nuclear as a technology for energy generation, I think there's a lot of applications where it makes sense. It's a good carbon-free source.
Yeah.
It has challenges associated with waste management,
right,
and fuel cycle and security. But I think there are ways that it can be managed and ways that also it can't be managed that where there's risk involved.
Yeah. Well, do you have any?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say like large scale nuclear does like concern me a little bit, just in that like I appreciate how it's generally very, very safe, but if something does go wrong, it can go wrong and cause huge problems.
Yeah.
So like I've read a little bit and looked into a little bit like more of like the modular nuclear, like smaller scale things that are easier and faster to implement, easier to control, less potential things to go wrong if something does go wrong. So I think nuclear, there's a huge potential. I'd rather see like the smaller scale stuff be developed, just from what I've heard about the increased safety, less risk involved in it, and the ease and the speed of setting it up.
This is a project from a class called Interdisciplinary Art and Design Practices, and we're creating a film that reacts to the problem of low-level medical nuclear waste and radiation, especially in the Cambridge, Somerville area. A couple questions I have for you is, to begin with, radiation is a famously invisible form of pollution, and so what does invisibility mean to you in your life, just very broadly?
Well, I mean, I'm an intensive care nurse, and I deal with MRI and CT and things like that on a daily basis.
And I work in medical devices.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
yeah.
Okay, you guys, extraordinary. Perfect that we found you.
So I mean, yeah, I guess it's something that I'm always wary of. Having to wear special equipment, such as for X-rays and things like that, and again, something we're told we can harm us on a daily basis, but not really seeing it on a daily basis. Yeah.
I'm always concerned about the out of sight, out of mind mentality, where if you can't see it, therefore it's not an issue. So that's always something that needs to be addressed beforehand in design.
Totally, and that's exactly the title of our film is Nuclear Blind Spots, and we're thinking of so-called low-level nuclear waste as it gets left out of the conversation when people talk about these, Chernobyl or these sort of like very shocking, almost like sexy images of nuclear. I'm curious also how you think about radiation, if either in your practice at work or just as people living. Is it a form of pollution that you find yourself thinking about or attentive to at all?
I guess more on a personal level, yeah, we deal with patients a lot who have radiation drugs and things along those lines. So I guess, yeah, on a personal level, just using my practice, double gloving, more I guess, waste management practices. How do I get rid of? But again, more getting it out of the room. I don't really give much thought about getting it out of the hospital room.
Right.
What
Once it's out of
after.
yeah.
I think that radiation is too broad of a term because there are too many things that involve radiation. There are very specific types of radiation pollution. So things like microwaves or other just, light is a form of radiation. So that is there needs to be a bit more specific. That way we can kind of drill down on the actual topics and the actual pollutants that need to be handled, but it's definitely, sometimes too broad, becomes too big of a thing to grasp, and therefore people don't want to think about it.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and just a last question. What are some other forms of pollution in your daily life that are like very obvious? If nuclear radiation is almost invisible, and as you're suggesting, it's out of sight, out of mind. Sure. What are some forms of pollution that you can't help but confront or interact with in a daily basis?
Cars,
plastics,
trash,
definitely,
litter,
the famous, the floating, plastic trash bag along the street kind of thing.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, we're in the city of Boston, which was famous for its river pollution back in the 80s, so it's kind of,
yeah, I would say, definitely the plastics are kind of the key ones. So.
Cool. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And this is hugely helpful for our project. It's